afternoon with Policy Presents. I'm Rebecca Flannery. Sorry about that very loud background music. We're there now. The Essential Freshwater package is part of a new national direction to protect and improve our rivers and waterways, our lakes, streams and wetlands. The Essential Freshwater package aims to stop further degradation, start making immediate improvement and reverse past damage. Consultation is again, yes, again, this is the second round after an unsuccessful first attempt. Today we are discussing wetlands and more importantly, what it means for you and your farming operation. Joining us today is National Board Member of Federated Farmers, Chris Allen, Dr. Paula Miere, Regional Policy Manager, and Senior Policy Advisor, Peter Wilson. We've already got lots of questions coming through and you can put yours in the chat just below there, the Q&A box. Chris Allen, what's your take on what's going and why is it that we're in the second round of consultation?
Thank you very much, Rebecca, and good afternoon, everyone. And coming from a beautiful spring day in mid-Canterbury. So the National Policy Statement and the National Environmental Standards are particularly important planning instruments, and they direct a lot of activities that are going on. But in amongst those and threaded through them is a lot to do with wetlands. So what we've got to do is make sure we get the understanding, the definition of what actually the wetland is, and that is where the wetland delineation tool comes in. It's a tool that's been developed by the US Army Corps, and it works relatively successfully over there. So to have a wetland, you've got to have the species you would expect to find in a wetland. You've got to have the the soils that you would expect to find in a wetland, and you've got to have the hydrology. So in amongst that, then you've got this tool. Then you have the policy response and what the policy that the government's come up with, and make sure the two actually connect together. So coming from our sunny Dunedin office, we've now got Peter Wilson, and he'll be supported by Paula Miere from Hamilton, and they're going to take us through what the consultation is talking about, because it's not all parts of the Wetland National Environmental Standard and NPS that they're consulting on. It's just a couple of very subtle bits, but they're very, very important. So I'll hand it over now to Peter, and it's all yours, Peter, coming from Dunedin.
Thank you, Chris, and noting that it's sunnier in Dunedin today than it is in mid-Canterbury. So effectively, yeah, the government is now having the second round of consultation on the Essential Freshwater package, because I think, to be fair to them, they've worked out that what the rules they put in place last year are simply not practical, and they're not going to work for farmers. And wetlands are such a complex environment that it's one of those places where you absolutely have to get the definitions right, and you have to get the policy right, or there can be some really negative unintended consequences out on farm. And that's certainly what the feedback Federated Farmers has been getting for the last year since the government put the original policy package out. So if we just to note, the government's actually wanting to change both the National Environmental Standard for freshwater, which are the nationwide rules that apply over the top of regional plans, and also the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management, which is the government direction to regional councils on how to write a regional plan. So if we go to the next slide, please. So at the moment, this is giving you the current situation out there on your property. At the moment, you need a resource consent for things like any utilities in a wetland, like jetties, signs, tracks, bridges, even mai. You need to get a consent for that. And you need a non-complying consent, which is like the second hardest type of consent there is, for doing even simple things like earthworks within 100 metres of a wetland, if it's likely to involve any drainage of the wetland or even partial drainage. Any vegetation clearance within a wetland or 10 metres of it, and carrying out earthworks within a wetland. The only exemptions to that are some minor restoration activities. And by minor, I mean so minor that you have to, the regulations even say you have to do it with handhold tools. So effectively, at the moment, it locks wetlands up, both in terms of what you can do to restore and enhance them, which goes against the government's definition, and the practicalities of farming such things as wet paddocks. And wet paddocks are sadly, most wet paddocks in New Zealand are at the moment under the wetland definition, sadly covered as a wetland and not part of a farm or improved pasture. And I'll get to that in a minute. And of course, any earthworks using damming or diverting water discharging within a wetland is prohibited. So what the government at the moment has done is, I think the policy people who thought about it, they were thinking of conservation land and national parks when they thought about wetlands. It's the idea that you can't really do anything to them at all. And in doing so, they've forgotten about what an active, dynamic and resilient feature a wetland usually is. So the problem we've got is that defining wetlands and writing what, a three-dimensional wonderful feature like a wetland, turning that into words for a policy is very hard to do. And the way the government's done it is lacks clarity. So we'll go to the next slide. So at the moment, the definition of a natural, there's a few nice photos there which show things that most people would think, oh, well, they're just paddocks. But at the moment, under most regional plans and the current rules, all of those areas will be classified as a wetland. You'd have to put a fence around them. You couldn't do anything except maybe graze a few sheep in them. You couldn't modify them. You certainly can't graze them. You couldn't do any earthworks in and around 100 meters from them. So the way the rules are written at the moment is they're going to make a large amount of pastoral country and farms unviable. So at the moment, that definition you can see there in red and strike throughs and underlines, that's the current definition of wetlands. Basically improved pasture that as of last year had more than wasn't more than 50% exotic pasture species and was subject to temporary rain-derived pooling. Now that captured large amounts of areas that we would just traditionally know as wet paddocks. They've had a few rushes, a few tussocks in them, but they had been grazed and happily sat there in that environment for over 150 years that we've had pastoral farming in New Zealand. The government has backed down a little bit, and it's dropping the improved pasture definition. It's dropped the temporary rain-derived pooling provision, and it's now just trying to provide an exemption for more than 50% bits of land that have more than 50% exotic pasture species in them. Although on the face of it, it's an improvement, but when you get into the detail, which we'll get to next, it's not actually an improvement at all, because they haven't said, how do you define 50%? Is it over the whole country? Is it at the paddock scale? Is it at the region scale? And sadly, in some regions, they're defining it down to 7 by 7 meter grids on the ground. So it still captures everything. Feds wants to see that done at least at the paddock scale to begin with. They also haven't defined what improved pasture or exotic pasture actually is, and they've kind of assumed that just because there's some indigenous species in and around a wetland, that they're somehow at loss from grazing, when a lot of them might have actually had their habitats enhanced due to the nutrient cycling effects of animals. So yeah, in summary, there's basically a lack of guidance around what a wetland is and what it isn't. And that hasn't got any better, even though I think the government wants it to get better. Next slide, please. So the good is the government is recognising there's some flaws, such as picking up areas of improved pastures as wetlands that are farms, and a lack of ability to practically maintain a wetland. A wetland is actually a lot like a farm. It needs active management. Weeds need to be pulled out. Water levels need to be maintained and managed. And the government, I think, definitely wants to fix that. But the bad is that the people writing these policies don't have a lot of practical experience on the ground. None of the proposed changes fix the issues that farming has with the regulations. And they're also sneaking through something I think quite dangerous. They're proposing that things like mining, infrastructure, urban development, they're proposing that those activities can get a consent, a resource consent, to damage or degrade or remove wetlands, urban sprawl, housing, mining, quarrying. But they've said, no, for farming, there's no ability for a farm to get a similar type of consent. So it's one rule for the city, one rule for urban, and no rules for the country. And that's quite dangerous, and it's quite a damaging precedent away from the old way that New Zealand used to look at things. We used to look at things on their effects. Now we're starting to say urban good and country bad, at least as far as wetlands go. Next slide, please. So if you have a look there on that thing on the left-hand side, that photo, I think you can probably just about count the number of rushes there are there. That's in Wellington. It's in the Wellington region. Currently, under the current definitions, that would be a natural wetland. You would have to fence it. You couldn't have any stock heavier than a sheep in there. You couldn't do any earthworks around it. You couldn't remove any vegetation, including a weed from it, except if you were doing it with handheld tools. And that's just the way the wetlands are written. So the improved pasture exempt, you'd think that the changes at the moment would fix it. But at the moment, unless Feds is successful at getting something like a paddock scale assessment through the ministry, we're pushing very hard for it, it would still be classed as a wetland. It is most definitely not a wetland. The government would have never had any intention of trying to capture that. And it's hard when you sit here and you do this job to work it out, why they got this so wrong. And I think it's because in the minds of the people writing these policies, they've assumed that grazing on land means the loss of wetlands automatically. When a wetland is it's a hydrological feature and a soil feature in the landscape. Lots of wetlands they just sit there regardless of what's on the surface of them. So wetlands are quite resilient, and that's the point we're trying to get across to the policy officials at the moment. So next slide, please. So maintenance and development of wetlands, lots of farmers and have done this for a long time, but certainly it's been an increasing uptake in recent years. Maintain and enhance wetlands. Wetlands are a great thing to have on your property. They cycle nutrients, they're good for duck shooting, they just look nice, attract birds. At the moment, the government recognises that the current rules are highly restrictive on if you want to put a wetland on or enhance a wetland on your property. If in effect you would put a wetland on and you would find it would come, you would do the right thing and you would find that you would get restricted with what you've done after you've done the right thing. So the Feds is trying to get some clarity on that. There's no clear definition at the moment on what you can do after a flood. If you need to do a bit of work in the drain, if you need to pull some soil and sediment away after the flood, it's not clear on how you deal with those natural hazards versus at what point could a regional council compliance officer come along and say, actually, you've broken the non-complying rule around draining a wetland. So there's nothing practical in the middle there that works for a farmer. And of course, I mentioned before, mining, quarrying, infrastructure, urban development, subdivision can apply for consents to damage or remove wetlands, but agriculture and rural activities can't, even if you promise to offset or build a wetland somewhere else on your property, which is much the same. Fortunately, the government's worked out that restoring wetlands with only a hand shovel just isn't going to be viable. We don't have a large labour army out there ready to run around with shovels in wetlands. So they've said that they are going to make it a little bit easier to maintain and enhance wetlands, and that's a small good thing with what's being proposed. But yeah, until Feds can fix this, at the moment, doing the right thing by a wetland, enhancing it, could harm you and put you into a compliance situation until we can get some clarity on that. Next slide, please. Oh, and we've finished. So I'm waiting some questions. All right, we have some questions here. So coming in, so we've got a question which is, while these changes are taking place, have the regional councils been told to halt or develop their plans, or they're still ploughing ahead using the flawed definitions as interpretations? So do the deadlines still apply? So I'm assuming this means the regional plans and various policies that are working their way through. So the answer to that is until the regulations change, they apply. So many regional councils are at least going through the motions of applying these wetland rules. But I think, to be fair to most of the regional councils, they know there are big problems with them. And depending on the quality of the staff, some are slow playing it, but others, and I think I used the Wellington example there before, are pushing ahead, probably with certainly quite a bit of zeal. And it's very much region by region. Some regions are good and some regions are probably pushing ahead too fast.
All right, we've got another question coming in. I have natural small lakes on my property that are grazed to the edges with sheep and beef cattle. They all look very tidy and haven't changed for 100 plus years. Where do I stand?
Sadly, at the moment, from 2023, under the stock exclusion rules, which is separate to this, you'll have to, and probably to say Feds is pushing quite hard to get some nuance and practicality into the stock exclusion rules through the freshwater farm plan, which might give you some exemptions. But at the moment, sadly, you'll have to fence out your beef cattle from 2023 or 2025, depending on the type of land you're on, whether it's flat or rolling. It's a sad case that shows. Sorry, Rebecca, you go.
No, we're all ears. I thought you'd finished. Apologies.
Yes, it's a sad case of where a farmer does the right thing by their land and the values on their land, but it's very hard to write a one-size-fits-all policy that covers that. And we're hopeful that we can get some exemptions for your situation through the freshwater farm plan when it comes around.
Excellent. Can you clarify the situation regarding irrigating close or onto a wetland, please?
It comes down to what a wetland is. So if it's improved, if it comes out that it's part of your farm and it's pasture with the new definitions, if we can get them right, you'll be it won't be a wetland, and so you can irrigate away. But of course, if it is a wetland and there's no way of keeping it as a paddock or a pasture, then it's a discharge into the wetland, and you probably won't be able to do it at the moment. And it's something we need to fix up.
Yeah, there'll be setbacks that apply effectively.
There's setbacks. Particularly, there's probably a bigger issue in the fertigation scenario. So if you've got some nutrients coming through, a bit of spreading of effluent, fertilizer, it would definitely be a no-no at the moment, unfortunately. It doesn't harm the wetland, but it harms the policy and the rules.
So just adding to that one then, Peter, if there's a 100-metre where you can't do any sort of earthworks, does that also apply that you can't spread fertilisers and other things in that 100-metre boundary of what is the wetland?
I think the 100-metre setback didn't apply to discharges. But yeah, you'd have to check that one. I think it's going to be challenging. You certainly, you don't want it to be within the 100-metre setback. I think you probably get out from that one, but the other setbacks will apply.
So that's why it's really important that our submission will be covering this around the setbacks, because it's not just the edge of the wetland. You've got another 100 metres potentially that you won't be able to, you'll have restricted activities within.
Yep.
And the two have got to tie together as a policy.
Yeah. And above all, the activity, I think there's this assumption with the policymakers that wetlands are fragile. And I mean, they are. I mean, it's certainly not encouraged to drain one, but a bit of fertilizer, a bit of spray drift, a few things like that that's getting into the wetland is not going to harm it practically.
What does this mean for on-farm water storage?
What it means for on-farm water storage is it becomes quite hard, because at what point does the lake you've put on for on-farm water storage, which is something we're encouraging, at what point do those margins, once it's established and they pick up some species and you've planted them, at what point does that get classified as a wetland? So we're pushing really hard to say any constructed lake, dam or wetland is excluded from the wetland definition. I think the government never intended to capture them, but the way they've written the rules, it inadvertently captures them.
While Feds might be pushing for workability, there will be other submitters pushing to keep these onerous definitions. Do we know how to counter those who claim the loss of wetlands is so great that there is no alternative?
It's a very good definition. I think it's a very good question. Sorry. I think that to that we would say that in the last 10 years, certainly our GIS and spatial analysis we've done at Feds showed that any further losses of wetlands since 2012, despite quite a lot of agricultural development happening that time, have been within the margin of error of analysis. So we were effectively about the same as we were in 2012. So we're not losing any more wetlands, and that's despite quite a substantial growth in exports and farming during that time. So the facts case supports us.
Minister Parker has said that he will not treat rural land as a national park. during our discussions on the RMA reform. Have we discussed this inequity regarding the wetland rules as they are applied to urban and rural activities with the Minister himself?
The minister needs to talk to his staff, because the wetland rules look like the sorts of rules you would apply to a national park or conservation land. That's the context they've had. So he needs to tell his officials that at the moment, they're not following on his instruction. But
and sorry, Peter. Yeah, and we have meetings with the minister previously and recently. We have pointed out that we want equity between how urban and rural are treated within the whole of the essential freshwater package, and it's done from an effects basis rather than from any other, point of view of doing it. So we have made the point clear, and as Peter says, we've made it clear to the staff as well, so that needs to feed through.
Yeah, and he does need to. I think that the challenge here is that it is an easy out for some officials to think, well, we can just got all this land out there, we can just solve the problems that we're not solving in our cities and offset them out to the country. And it does seem it's one of the unfortunate features that I think is coming through policy making at the moment, is that's the mindset of people. And we do have an uphill challenge to get ahead of that. I think we will win in the end. There's a certain practicality that will kick in. But yeah, there's a big challenge there.
How will these onerous rules actually be policed?
I think it's another real worry, because there'll be practical regional councils, or more honest places in the regions where they don't have the staff to enforce them, but it leaves it at the mercy of the compliance officer. And there'll be other regional councils where you do get a zealous staff member or a zealous division, and the farmers in those places are at risk. And that's not fair. Justice can't come down to the whim of a compliance officer and a loose rule.
Is there an altitude or slope angle exclusion from having to apply to stock exclusion itself?
At the moment, having to apply stock exclusion, at the moment, there is current talk of applying a slope exclusion rule, of not applying it as tightly on steeper land, but that's still up for discussion. It's not enforced yet. That's one of the other consultations Feds is dealing with at the moment, which is the low slope stuff that was wrong when it came out last year and needs a substantial degree of fixes to make it workable.
Yeah, and there's also a proposal for 500 meter exclusion, altitude exclusion within that low slope as well. We talked about that in the last policy presents. So while that sort of fixes some of the issues with the low slope land, overall we still think there's major issues and they should go away from a hardwired map.
Yeah, we just couldn't find a way to make the low slope map and the stock exclusion rules work on a nationwide basis. Really, it has to be left to regional councils who know their land to say which bits need to have stock excluded and which bits don't.
Does enhancing a wetland qualify for carbon credits?
At the moment, unfortunately, it doesn't. And this is one of these problems, that all the modelling around carbon sequestration and uptake was focused on forests, because forests were easy to model and map and measure. But yet a wetland can do quite a lot for carbon too. But the science on modelling it and getting some certainty on those models and some ground truthing hasn't been done to the same degree that it's been done in forests. So yes, wetlands do, but it's quite complex.
Are all the farming representative groups on the same page with these issues? Will the feedback and changes be aligned, and how do we know?
There'll be a relaxation of the rules in favour of farming. I think that's certain. And the farming groups are all on the same page on this one, which is quite nice. Dairy New Zealand, Beef and Lamb, Fonterra, we're all aligned and talking a lot as we write these submissions.
Yep.
Okay. Did you have a comment, Chris?
No.
There will be many wetlands in the margins of rivers where there may be significant protection by existing plants, for example, willows. Should we be aiming to get the ability to carry out farming activities much closer in these situations than is currently proposed? Perhaps the status of the consent applications could be lower than non-complying.
It could be. and that's one of the classic cases, because you could go and do an urban development under these proposals quite close to the river and get a consent for it, and they would say yay, but you can't farm. And so if they're doing one rule for urban, they have to go and do another rule for country. But the problem is that the mindset is that farming is bad for wetlands, therefore no lower status or no easier consent pathway will be given. Which is patently
that
unfair.
wraps up the questions. Yes, patently unfair, but it sounds like you're doing a marvellous job working through it all. Final comments or thoughts from our panel today?
One point I'd just ask Peter and Paul to answer. So if I was going to recreate a wetland and it happened to have been a wetland 100 years ago, should I be worried?
At the moment, sadly, I think you should be, because it will inadvertently, and it's not the government's fault, it's just the way the rules are written, will fall into being classified as a natural wetland. And then you won't be allowed to do anything in it except run around with a garden shovel pulling out a weed when you've got the chance.
Yeah,
Thank you,
and
Peter.
that's something we've got to change, Chris. We've got to, not make wetlands and restoring wetlands particularly, and putting new wetlands in a liability. We need to make them an asset, and these rules make them a liability, and that's very problematic.
There is
Thanks,
just
Tim.
one final question. Do we have a minute?
Why not?
Will do.
What about places like Poolburn? They have naturally occurring pools. The clue is in the name. What happens there?
I think it will come down to how tough the regional council wants to be, because technically they'll be wetlands.
Right. Well, that wraps it up. Thank you so much. No final comments at all?
I'll just say we will be fighting hard for farmers, as we always do. The government's trying to engage, to be fair. Obviously, we wouldn't be in this situation if they hadn't put such poorly drafted regulations on the table in the first place a couple of years ago, that we have to keep revisiting and revisiting. I think this is the fourth or fifth set that we're trying to play with, but we'll keep pushing with Team Ag to get the best outcome for farmers we can.
And all these regulations, they're all intertwined. So we might be looking at wetlands, but we're looking at stock exclusion. We're looking at stock exclusion, and then we're looking at something else. We've got the national policy statement coming over the top. So great having a big team working hard on this on behalf of our members. So thanks, team.
Thank you. And thank you for joining us today. We hope you learned more about wetlands and what they mean for you and your farm. Don't forget, if you want to rewatch this session, go to our website. We'll have it up later today. And don't forget also, our policies are member driven. It is all about you. Members' views are canvassed by our elected representatives and our policy team. And that's where we formulate our submissions and try and help the government, local and central government, in their decision making. And remember, we're always happy to talk offline. That's what we're here for, and that's why you're a member of Federated Farmers. If you have any questions, do get in touch. Events at fedfarm.org.nz, and we'll point you in the right direction. We'll be covering lots more topics this year, and if you've got a suggestion, again, reach out and let us know what your questions, concerns or issues are, and keep an eye on the Friday Flash for more topics on our Policy Presents. Have a great Thursday. Goodbye.